This week, we're going to start talking about media bias. And you should probably know by now that bias is when somebody has an opinion about an issue one way or another. Okay. They're not looking at just the facts, but they are looking at a particular issue through the lens of their own, what we call political ideology. Okay. In general, bias is just you show an opinion one way or the other. But when we're talking about the news and media bias, we're talking about their the political ideology that they skew toward, whether it be a conservative view, which we tend to connect with Republican Party, or a liberal view, which we tend to connect with the Democratic Party, although it's really more broad than that. Or is it a fairly middle of the road, unbiased view? So what we want to start looking at today is how do we start to recognize those biases? And in order to recognize those biases, you're going to have some background in political ideology. So we're going to spend a couple of days trying to figure out what would be considered a liberal view and what would be considered a conservative view, left or right, as we call them. Left being liberal and right being conservative. So our objectives for this particular unit, we want to be able to do 4 things when we're done with this unit. 1, I can identify and explain how media bias affects how news is reported, consumed, and interpreted. So we know that, we know what media is by now. We know what bias is by now, but the word consumed here, okay? When we consume something, we might eat it up, devour it, okay? So when we're consumers, we buy things, we watch things, we pay for things. Consumption it's more than just eating things, okay? So when I say that we consume certain types of media, that means that we eat it up. That's what we want to buy. That's where we want to spend our time, our money. Okay. So how does the bias affect how news is reported, how we interpret it, how we consume it? All of those things go into this particular lesson for the next week or so. I understand the major differences between liberal and conservative political ideologies and how they affect the media. I can consider my own personal stance and how it affects how I consume and interpret information, mainstream media in particular. So I want you guys to start thinking about, what are your budding political ideologies? And at this point in your life, they probably pretty closely mirror whatever your parents think. But, when you start looking into what do the left think? What do the right think? What do you think? And where do you stand on that spectrum? Because that's going to help you understand how you interpret what you see in the news or read or hear. Finally, I will write an informative essay highlighting the similarities and differences of 3 news articles on the same topic and explaining how different political lenses color each article. So those are our objectives for this unit. Our essential questions. 1 is, why do we need to be savvy consumers of mass media? Why is it important that we understand how to interpret what we see and hear and read? What skills do we need to understand, interpret, and evaluate mass media? Mass media, mass meaning it covers a great area. In the case of our mass media, it's really global at this point, okay? You can find anything from anywhere on the internet. And finally, how do political biases affect how information is reported, consumed, and interpreted? And I don't need that comma there, so it's bothering me, but I'll change it later. So there's this really interesting little media bias chart that I found a couple of years ago. And what it does is it takes a look at the news from 2 different angles. 1 is the quality. How good is it? How good is the source? Is it reliable? Is it credible? Can we trust that what they say is factual and true? And the other is their bias. What kind of political or ideological spin has been put on that information? So what this woman did was she went through all of these major news sources, and she took a look at those things and put them on a chart. So let's watch that. It's only about 4 or 5 minutes long here, what she did. Oops, I forgot that I am in the wrong mode for that. So let's go back, shall we?
A couple years ago, patent attorney Vanessa Otero ran into a problem that just about anyone who's active on social media will recognize.
It really started in 2016 in the run-up to the last presidential election. I just started becoming very alarmed about the kind of quality and bias of information that people would use to support their arguments to their friends on Facebook. I thought it might be helpful to just kind of map it like better, worse, left and right. So I just started piecing it together on my own just to explain to my friends. We've had this overabundance and proliferation of online news sources, and most of it is in the area of analysis and opinion. If people understood that the sources they're consuming are actively making them angrier and polarizing them, then they might choose to consume less of that.
So what she's pointing out here is a lot of what we see that's called news is actually opinion. Okay, it's still news, but there is a commentator putting their own personal opinion into the news and telling us how we should be interpreting that news. So we have to keep in mind that what we see on the news isn't always just fact. A lot of times it's somebody's opinion on those facts and how they want to spin those facts to change our beliefs and our ideas.
Otero's chart categorizes the media landscape using two domains: facts versus editorializing, and left versus right-leaning views.
It's a two-dimensional taxonomy. So the vertical axis is quality. So in general, the better quality, best quality stuff is at the top, and the lowest quality stuff is at the bottom. The horizontal axis is bias. So you have like your neutral or balanced stuff in the middle.
Viewers will recognize big names like CNN and Fox News, but Otero says she's starting to get requests to add smaller outlets too. Extreme partisan sources like Breitbart and Wonkette appear at the ends of the axes.
When she says extreme, or he says extreme partisan sources, he means news outlets that specifically and very, very drastically either skew to the conservative right or to the liberal left. That if you are looking at that source, you are going to get a completely and utterly biased opinion.
As a whole, the chart provides a frame of reference for a news industry that is growing increasingly partisan.
So much of the the content that we consume right now is telling you how you should feel about a subject. The stories, like when they break, and then what the spin on them, the takes on them 24 hours later, are really revealing.
Believe it or not, social scientists don't think the polarized media climate has done much permanent damage to democracy yet. But it's not exactly harmless either. An analysis of Nielsen data from the Knight Foundation shows a widening gap between liberals who say they trust the media and conservatives who say they don't. The Pew Research Center finds that the most partisan among us are more likely to be steering the broader political conversation. A comprehensive chart of political media, then, could serve as a sort of guide for those who want to make up their own minds. Or, to hear Otero tell it,
what the media bias chart is an anchor.
Of course, Otero is just one person, with her own biases and blind spots.
I've taken into account certain criticisms. I have actually made adjustments to certain sources, especially from some of the really earlier versions. If the sample was really unfair that I selected, then I can go back and look at that and take those comments into account, especially if I get those comments from a lot of the readers of that source and other sources.
Until now, Otero has mostly managed the project herself. But she recently finished crowdfunding more than $32,000 to hire more analysts, vet more sources, and make her charting process more transparent.
Right now there are 104 sources. We'd like to include, we expand to 200, 300, 400 sources pretty soon on an interactive web-based version. But there's a limit to what I can do on my own. I've developed really robust methodologies, really granular methodologies, the headline, the picture or graphic, the lead or the chyron, and then individual sentences for quality and bias. I've just started recruiting a team of analysts to help me do that. I just really felt a responsibility to improve that as much as I could because people are relying on it, and I just fundamentally feel that if you're going to put out information that influences people, which this does, then you have a responsibility to make it as good as you can.
In the future, Otero hopes her chart could be a sort of Consumer Reports for media ratings, both in terms of its comprehensive reach and its reputation as a reliable guide.
I want to make the news consumers smarter and the news media itself better. And those things are both really lofty, but I think it's doable. There are folks who just, if they had this information, would make better choices as consumers of media first and then citizens.
All right, so her chart I have put right here on the next page. And this is updated in 2018, this particular version of the chart. And if you click on the chart, you can actually go to a page that's all about how reliable your news sources are. So if you're just looking at some of the most common news sources that you've probably heard, you have NBC News, ABC News, CBS News. They're all put in here as being kind of neutral. CNN is another very popular news source. It's showing as skews left, which would be slightly liberal. You are looking at MSNBC, which skews even more to the left. Here she says it's hyperpartisan, meaning that it is pretty liberal, okay, and that they're pretty unabashedly liberal, that they don't apologize for it. They make it very clear. Another very popular news source is Fox News, and you're going to see it's over here under what they call hyper-partisan right, meaning that they are unabashedly conservative, right-leaning Republican news source. So what we're going to see is that people will tend to choose their news source based on their political preferences because people like to hear what they want to hear. It's just like when we were talking about confirmation bias a few weeks back. People want to hear what they want to hear. So if you are a very, very right-leaning conservative type of person, you're going to be likely to watch Fox News because they're going to interpret the news the way you want to interpret the news. You're not going to want to watch MSNBC because they're just going to make you angry, because they're going to tell you probably the opposite of what you believe to be true or want to be true, regardless of what is true or factual at all. Okay. So we're going to investigate how is that helping us or is that hurting us? Or is it doing a little bit of both? So on the next slide here, I have a video from a professor at the University of Texas. And she goes very specifically, it's only like a 5-minute video, but she goes really specifically into the bias in our choices and why we choose what we do and how that is affecting the way that we understand the media. So I'm going to go ahead and let this roll, okay? And then give you your assignment for the day. So let's take a look at what Miss Natalie Stroud, PhD, who is an assistant professor of communication, has to say.
Our personal beliefs about politics really affect where we turn for news. So in my own research, I've looked at people's newspaper reading habits, their cable news viewing habits, their radio listening habits, and their internet website preferences. And what I found is that for the sources on which people regularly rely, their partisanship absolutely affects where they turn. For example, for conservative Republicans, about 65% will look at one conservative Republican source or a source leaning to the right. In contrast, only around 25% of liberal Democrats will look at a source that leans to the right. The numbers are absolutely reversed when we look at the other side. So, for example, about 75% of liberal Democrats look at a source that leans to the left. In contrast, only about 40% of conservative Republicans do so. So, as you see, there's quite a discrepancy in partisan habits of looking at media. Essentially, what people have done is find out what media sources are their friends, and they turn there, and what sources are their enemies, and they avoid those. It's a great question to figure out whether or not there are unbiased media outlets. And the truth is, it's really hard to point to one and say, finally, we have found an unbiased media outlet. Because for any media outlet out there, there are going to be people who perceive that outlet as articulating views that are hostile to their beliefs. So people will see any media outlet and say, that's biased against my political perspective. Even though we might not be able to point to an outlet as being unbiased, we still should care, because what this means is that when people are looking at media outlets that match their beliefs, they might see that outlet as being relatively unbiased, even though the other side might see that outlet as being extremely biased. So we should care, because this leads people to look at outlets that match what they believe on both sides of the political spectrum, and believe that those outlets are relatively fair purveyors of truth. I think that partisan media both help and hurt democracy. On the helpful side, partisan media engage the public. It's really invigorating and energizing when you see someone articulating beliefs with which you believe and articulating them with passion. So this can help people to participate politically. These sources also help to make sense of a really complex world of politics. So when you're looking at a source that's articulating a partisan perspective, you realize, oh, this is what side one believes, this is what side two might happen to believe. So in that sense, partisan media are doing a great service to us democratically. However, there are also some downsides to partisan media, in the sense that they can lead people to hold more polarized political beliefs. So if you believe on side X, and you're watching media outlets that convey a similar perspective, that can really lead you to believe that your side is correct, and that the other side really doesn't have that much to offer. So if we have people polarizing in their political views, and if we have people believing that very different issues are important and in need of solving, that can lead to some difficult times for the citizenry in terms of negotiating issues. It's another tricky question. On the one hand, perhaps diversifying our news outlet exposure could be helpful. So if we were to look at media outlets that disagree with what we believe, that could have a really helpful effect if we were to look at that and say, okay, let's really analyze what the other side might happen to be saying on this particular topic. However, if we turn to the other side with the purpose of looking for signs of bias, or with the purpose of laughing at what they might have to say, or counter-arguing the information that we find there, I don't think that looking at the other side will have any benefit in terms of giving people a greater appreciation of views unlike their own. What we need to do is figure out a way to get people to be charitable in terms of their interpretation of the other side when they look at diverse media outlets. So when you turn to an outlet that disagrees with your views, can you give a charitable understanding of that argument?
By the way, if you've never been to Austin, try to get there sometime. It's a pretty cool place. By the way, I feel like I should have said beforehand, she uses the word partisan a lot. Partisan has part in it, meaning that you part ways. Okay, partisan is related to political parties, meaning a partisan view might be very highly conservative, or it may be very highly liberal, or it may be nonpartisan, which is supposed to mean middle of the road and we're all doing our best to come to an agreement. So what you're going to do for today's assignment, after you have watched the Edpuzzle and answered the questions, is you are going to fill out this slide. This is a simple KWL chart, okay? What do I know? What do I want to know? And what have I learned? So what you're going to do today is, in the first column, write down what you already know about liberal versus conservative ideologies. What do you already know about liberal, or Democrat is, just, there's more than that. Okay. There's democratic socialists, there's socialists, et cetera, et cetera. Or what do you know about conservative ideologies? We tend to say conservatives tend to be Republicans, but again, there's more political parties than that. We just really only talk about the two major ones a lot of the time. So what do you think you know? So what do I know, or what do I think I know? So even if you're not sure, I just want you to write down what you think you know. I think this. In the middle, write down the questions you have about this topic. So this is what I want to know. What are my questions? Okay. And then we're going to complete this final column, what I have learned after we've done some further research. So for today, you are only responsible for filling out column 1 and column 2. What I know or think I know, what I want to know, or any questions I have. So that is your assignment for today. And later on in the week, we are going to look at several news articles. We're going to look at 3 of them. And we are going to use what we've learned to try to determine whether we are getting a partisan bias or not. And if we are getting a partisan bias, when we look at that source, how do we know that that's the bias we're seeing? And how do we then adjust what we understand to reflect that bias? Okay. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. It is best to email, text, or call, because if you leave comments on Google Classroom or if you leave messages through Clever, I don't get to those as quickly. Okay. So please email, text, or call if you have questions, and have a great day.